When you go out to eat, would you prefer to receive a menu with very few options curated by the chef, a 2 to 6 page menu, or no menu at all at a restaurant where you can simply order whatever you wanted? How would each of these scenarios make you feel? That menu question may seem trivial, but it points to something deeper. We often assume that happiness increases as freedom increases. More options, more autonomy, more control, more happiness. But what if that's only partly true? What if a good life sometimes requires not more freedom, but the right constraints, commitments that bind us to other people, to a community, to God, or to a cause? That is where service begins. You are listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life, a podcast about ancient wisdom, modern psychology, and the search for a life that is not only successful, but meaningful. I'm Michael Sadlow. Today, service, freedom, and the happiness that can come from being needed. In the last few episodes, we've considered two paradigms of the good life. The first is the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of suffering. The second is the cultivation of virtues. In this episode, we will turn to a third paradigm, that of service. A life of service asks us to give up some freedom, not because freedom is bad, but because unconstrained freedom can become exhausting, lonely, and directionless. Freedom is indispensable. The problem is freedom without form, freedom with no commitment strong enough to give it direction. Service gives freedom a shape. It binds us to God, to other people, to a community, or to a cause. To understand what a life devoted to service can mean, we need first to understand the link between freedom and happiness. In an influential paper called Self-Determination, The Tyranny of Freedom, Barry Schwartz, a professor of psychology, argued that there was a causal link between our growing ability to choose and the explosive increase in depression rates. We experience control to a degree that people living in other times and places would think quite unimaginable, he writes. So why are we so unhappy? Schwartz singles out three negative ramifications of all of this freedom. First, it leads us to unrealistic expectations. When we feel that we have infinite choice, we expect that our choices will be perfect. We expect to be able to have well-paying, satisfying jobs, for example, and perfect spouses and children. When the results don't live up to these expectations, not only are we disappointed at the results themselves, but also we feel that we have only ourselves to blame. In one interesting experiment, consumers were much happier with their choice of jam when given a more limited selection of products from which to choose. A second ramification of our extraordinary freedom of choice is that individualism heightens expectations of perfection. People have every opportunity to perfect themselves, and when they fail, Schwartz writes, the culture of individualism biases them toward making causal attributions that focus on internal rather than external factors. It leaves people with a crushing and continuing sense of their own failure. Maybe not coincidentally, it thus also fuels industries that seek to address our imperfections, such as the beauty and weight loss businesses. Third, our emphasis on autonomy and individualism necessarily is in tension with our need for sociality. Being part of a group requires that we give up some of our autonomy. Each group has its own norms and expectations, and they tend to exclude those who willfully violate them. This kind of push and pull between autonomy and adherence to group norms happens all down the line, from formal groups to friend circles. The less autonomy we are willing to sacrifice, the less connected we are to others. Less social connection is strongly correlated with higher rates of depression. Studies of Amish and Hasidic communities that strictly limit the freedom of their members also suggest this trend toward less depression. Here's the point. Every act of serving another is, in effect, a limit put on one's autonomy. That is, we accept, in most cases voluntarily, that we will put another being or group ahead of our own desires. Whether temporarily or for a longer period of time, we constrain our freedom. And we do that in most cases because on some level, it makes us feel good. There are thus three dimensions for us to explore. The first is what a life of service really means or looks like. The second is its attraction. And the third is its drawbacks. What do you think of when I use a phrase like a life of service? I think that for many today, it summons visions of a lawyer working as a full-time public defender, a doctor who treats the poor or those in war zones, or a child who sacrifices aspects of their career or social life to care for an ailing parent. I think that this is why, when I ask my own students whether they see themselves in a life of service, they tend to answer negatively, even as they express admiration for those who made the choice. But it's worth deepening our understanding of service and seeing it within a wider context. That context has always been inextricably bound to religion. The Bible often, if not quite consistently, posits that our purpose, or telos, as human beings, is to serve God. At the beginning of Genesis, God first creates the world and everything in it, and caps off creation on the sixth day with the creation of human beings. Their purpose is to fill the earth and master it, ruling over all the other creatures. Just a few short verses later, in what biblical critics call the second creation account, humans are created in order to till the soil and develop the earth. Both accounts are cryptic, and interpreters have puzzled over them for millennia. What does master and rule mean here? Especially since the very next verse suggests that humans are there only to eat fruit. Does the second account suggest that our purpose is only to tend to the Garden of Eden, from which, by the way, Adam and Eve were quickly expelled? Or more generally, does it suggest that God created us in order to till, develop, and order the untamed and wild earth? We are meant to serve God, but it remains somewhat unclear how we are to do so. Jews and Christians have drawn different answers to this question. Jews base their understanding of this service on later passages in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament as Christians call it. Most of the classical rabbis, whose literature formed the foundation of modern Judaism, adopted some form of covenantal theology. That is, it proceeds from the idea that God has made a covenant, or a deal, with Israel, a contract. The deal has two sides. On the one hand, God pledges to protect and love Israel. On the other hand, Israel promises to do God's will. God's will is seen as expressed in scores of commandments, or mitzvot. Sometimes the term mitzvah today is used colloquially to express a good deed. Traditionally and theologically, though, it is a commandment, a discrete act that God requires. These commandments encompass both ethical and ritual realms. Do not murder or do not steal are ethical commands. Guard the Sabbath to keep it holy is a ritual one, as are the laws of kashrut, those outlining forbidden and permitted foods. Jewish thinkers throughout the ages have reflected on the role of these commandments and have come to several, sometimes very different, conclusions. Some modern liberal Jewish thinkers, for example, see a great divide between ethical and ritual commandments and emphasize the importance of the former over the latter. While there is certainly precedent for this position in the Bible itself, most Orthodox Jewish thinkers reject such a sharp dichotomy. Thus, within this discussion of mitzvot, a basic tension often arises. Are the mitzvot carefully given to enhance human well-being? That is, are they an expression of God's love for us? Or are they a set of rules that are sometimes arbitrary, adherence to which requires to show fealty to God? Are the rabbis saying that God requires Jews to observe the mitzvot because they comprise the law of the land, as it were, even if they don't always make sense? Or are they saying that the mitzvot are to be considered as strong suggestions for our own well-being, but as such can change as we in our times change? I've extended this discussion of the mitzvot and just touched the surface of its complexity because of its direct bearing on our thinking about a life of service and the role of freedom. Put simply, the mitzvot offer a model, at least conceptually, even if not in all of its details, for constructing a life of service. They also illustrate that such a life always comes with trade-offs. To many who observe them, the mitzvot offer a path to serving God through discrete quotidian actions. In any given day, an observant Jew might feel obliged to perform dozens of mitzvot through prayers, their eating choices, business dealings, and personal relationships. So does it lead to happiness? Certainly for some, the structured life of following the commandments provides a deep sense of purpose that also brings with it several other psychological benefits, such as reminders to be grateful, a feeling of awe, and community. Psychologically, the pointed structure that comes with a Jewishly observant life can also add to well-being. I don't think we have any actual empirical evidence that those who live by the mitzvot are happier than the members of some control group, but at least anecdotally, it does seem to work for many. The benefit of the observance of the mitzvot, it is important to note, is for many Jews only marginally tied to hope for an afterlife. That is, while Jewish tradition does have a strain that asserts that living according to God's will, as enacted in the punctilious adherence to the mitzvot, leads to a good afterlife, the promise of eternal happiness most often serves as a secondary role. Jewish traditions and the practice of ordinary Jews emphasizes the benefit of the mitzvot for living in this world. One serves God because it is one's purpose to do so, and will lead to living a life, here and now, alive and breathing, that is closer to God. Most Jews today, however, find a life structured by the mitzvot to be burdensome and arbitrary, disconnected from any sense of purpose, and inconvenient to boot. In the context of a pluralistic world with nearly unprecedented choice, among Jews who are largely integrated in majority non-Jewish cultures, they can seem constraining and even embarrassing. Such Jews don't necessarily reject all the mitzvot. They may well enjoy and get spiritual fulfillment out of attending a Passover Seder or synagogue on Yom Kippur. Nor do they necessarily reject a life dedicated to service. They may change their frame of reference to serving other people, whether doing so directly or through political action. Such service to others is often seen as connected to one's purpose, and sometimes service to God. But the point I'm trying to make is that the service to God through the mitzvot is largely in tension with our modern valorization of free choice. Some, though, voluntarily choose these constraints in exchange for the belief that they are living a purposeful life in service to God, which in many cases also brings with it for them a sense of enhanced well-being. Christian models of service overlap with Jewish ones, but they tend to have a different emphasis. Rick Warren, for example, argues in his best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life, that we must each find and follow our own divine-given purpose. Mother Teresa, on the other hand, exemplifies a life of service that seeks to imitate Christ, a life of imitatio Dei. Rick Warren is one of the most well-known evangelical pastors in the United States, the founder and former leader of the Saddleback Church, which claims a weekly attendance of 30,000 members. Warren argues that we are made by and for God. God created us for God's own enjoyment. Our purpose as human beings, then, is to surrender to God by doing God's will. As he writes, everybody eventually surrenders to something or someone. If not to God, you will surrender to the opinions or expectations of others, to money, to resentment, to fear, or to your own pride, lusts, or ego. You were designed to worship God, and if you fail to worship him, you will create other things, idols, to give your life to. You are free to choose what you surrender to, but you are not free from the consequences of that choice. Surrender is not the best way to live. It is the only way to live. Nothing else works. All other approaches lead to frustration, disappointment, and self-destruction. According to Warren, the challenge is to recognize this essential fact about human existence and to surrender to God. To Warren, we all have 5 individual purposes. First, since we are designed for God's pleasure, we must love God through worship. Second, we are designed or shaped for service, so we must minister to others. Third, we are made for a mission, and so must evangelize, spreading God's message. Fourth, we are intended to be part of God's family, so we must embrace fellowship, especially in and through a church. Fifth, we were created to be like Christ, and so must grow in maturity through discipleship. Warren emphasizes that while we all generally have the same set of purposes, they're going to manifest differently, depending on each individual. Every person is unique and endowed with their own special gifts and talents. We are all obligated to serve God, but we do so differently. For example, a master plumber might volunteer to fix a broken sink in the church, unclog the drain of a poor elderly congregant, or oversee the installation of plumbing in a new house built as part of a mission. A person talented at making money might do so in order to donate more to good causes. Both the plumber and the wealthy CEO are valued the same here, and God would not want the person good at making money but lousy at fixing sinks to oversee a plumbing installation. Why serve God in this way? Ultimately, the goal is to achieve eternal life. Life is a temporary assignment, as Warren titles one of his chapters. Life's journey is about preparing to go home, to heaven, your eternal home. In this way, too, our task is imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. Just as Jesus came down on earth on temporary assignment, so do we. An extraordinarily strong sense of imitatio Dei also lies behind the extraordinary activities of Mother Teresa, who was canonized as a saint in 2016. Mother Teresa, an Albanian, took her first religious vows as a nun in the Order of the Sisters of Loreto in 1931 at the age of 20. She served in India, and in 1946 felt called to minister to the very poorest, sickest, and most vulnerable of residents. She founded the Missionaries of Charity in 1950 in Calcutta. The mission opened hospices, leprosy outreach, orphanages, and medical clinics, eventually spreading throughout India. Her efforts were recognized by a Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. Mother Teresa's work with the very needy was bound to her faith. As she put it in an interview, the work is the means of putting our love of Christ into action. She saw her purpose as imitatio Dei, trying to be like Christ in his ministering to the needy. Although she ministered in India to many non-Christians, her work was so heavily embedded in her faith that she was sometimes critiqued, especially by the Hindu right, who accused her of Christian missionary activity. The Jewish and Christian views that we have explored which I want to emphasize cannot capture the rich diversity of opinions in either tradition, depart from a similar theological proposition. God made humans for a purpose. That purpose, in turn, reflects back to God and requires a combination of service and imitation. Both emphasize the need to serve those who are less fortunate, because it is God's wish that we imitate him. The differences between these Jewish and Christian views are also worth exploring. The Jewish view emphasizes that a life structured by regular and uniform activities is grounded by the belief that God provided this structure out of love for our own well-being in this world. Mother Teresa and Rick Warren emphasize service to others in a more personal and less structured, if no less intense way. We have to find our unique purpose through our personal relationships with God, and then try to figure out how to fulfill it, usually in the context of helping others or the community. The reason that we do this is that this is our mission on earth as we prepare for eternal life. But does a life of service require belief in God? Viktor Frankl gives us one of the most powerful modern answers: no, but it may require love. Viktor Frankl was born to a Jewish family in Vienna in 1905 and trained as what we would call a psychologist. He had recently married when, at the age of 37, he was sent to the Nazi concentration camps. He survived, and shortly after liberation wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, which became an international bestseller. In this book, he recounts his experience in the camps and ties it to his theory of logotherapy. Frankl posits that we have an innate desire to have a purpose. Without a purpose, we drift and lose hope. He observed that those inmates who lost their sense of purpose were the ones most likely to perish. On the one hand, Frankl states that each individual must find their own purpose. It almost seems arbitrary. On the other hand, though, Frankl clearly thinks that purpose must be rooted in love and connection to others. As he wrote, "Love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasp the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world may still know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment." We all love. It is a resource that we can tap. It is in love for another that we find purpose. He illustrates this approach with a story. Once, an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question: "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you?" "Oh," he said, "for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered." Whereupon I replied, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering, to be sure, at the price that you now have to survive and mourn her." He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice. Even when suffering has meaning outside of any theological framework, love leads to service. We have a psychological desire to feel needed. Studies have shown that feeling like we matter to others correlates with a better sense of well-being. Having a sense of purpose is a manifestation of this need. Our purpose is usually connected to the sense that we matter to someone or something. Service, in turn, is an expression of purpose. We serve because we feel our service matters. Service can take many forms. It can mean obedience to God's commandments. It can mean using one's gifts for a divine mission. It can mean caring for the sick, the poor, the vulnerable, or the people closest to us. It can mean giving ourselves to a cause. In each case, service limits the self. It says, "My freedom is real, but it is not ultimate. I am bound to something beyond myself." Next time, we turn to the fourth and final orientation, detachment, which asks whether happiness comes not from binding ourselves more deeply, but the opposite of loosening our grip. So here are two questions to sit with this week. Whom or what do you serve now? And where in your life might greater commitment, even at the cost of some freedom, make your life feel more meaningful? You're listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life with me, Michael Sadlow. Readings, resources, and ways to support the podcast are available in the show notes and at mlsadlow.com. I welcome your questions and feedback.